What is that you're drawing?
We need to report this immediately. It looks like a schematic.
All right, folks, let's everybody remain calm. I'll take a look.
They mocked the quiet black boy on the plane. Then the captain made an unexpected announcement. Act 1. The viral hook. The flight that nobody on board will ever forget. Something is happening at the front of the plane. Not mechanical. Not turbulence. Not the kind of something that requires a safety briefing or an announcement from the flight deck. The kind of something that moves person to person, seat to seat, in the invisible, instantaneous way that discomfort travels through a confined space, through the press of a shoulder turning, the shift of a head, the slight adjustment of a body that wants to look but also wants to pretend it isn't looking. Flight 1874 from Atlanta to Boston is 40 minutes into its cruise altitude. The sky outside the oval windows is the deep, untroubled blue of a clear October morning. The flight, by every instrument in the cockpit, is proceeding exactly as it should. Systems normal. Weather clear. 81 minutes from touchdown. But something is happening in row 3. Row 3 is first class, the third row of the forward cabin, which holds 16 seats arranged in the wide, cushion configuration that the airline reserves for its premium passengers. The seats are the kind that recline into near flatness. The headrests are adjustable. There is real glassware, not plastic. There is a coat hook above each seat. Small details, all of them, but details that collectively communicate a message that the airline has been sending deliberately for decades. You have arrived, the message says. You have reached the level at which things are different. In seat 3A, against the window, sits a boy. He has not moved in 20 minutes. He sits with the stillness of someone who has developed, from long practice, the ability to be completely at rest in his body while his mind runs at full speed. His hands are folded in his lap. He is looking out the window. The clouds below the aircraft are brilliant white and enormously soft-looking, like something you could fall into, and the boy is watching them with the focused, patient attention of someone who is thinking something specific about clouds. Something technical. Something that has nothing to do with how soft they look. His name is Malik. He is 11 years old. Beside him in 3B, separated from him by the width of an armrest, sits his mother. Her name is Danielle. She has the posture of a woman who practices posture the way musicians practice scales, automatically, constantly, as the baseline from which everything else operates. She is reading something on her phone, but her attention is not entirely on the phone. Part of her attention is always, in any room, on Malik. The part that reads rooms. The part that tracks. In the row ahead of them, row 2, seats A and B, sits a man named Gregory Holt. He is 48 years old, and he is a district sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, and he has been flying first class for 11 years, and he has opinions about first class, about who belongs in it, about what it represents and who it is designed for. He holds these opinions the way some people hold opinions that have never been seriously tested, with the particular assurance of a man whose beliefs have always been confirmed by his environment, because his environment has always been arranged, by money and circumstance and the specific advantages of his specific life, to confirm them. He said something 10 minutes ago. Something small. Something he said at a volume calibrated precisely at the level where it could not quite be officially heard, but could absolutely be functionally heard by every person in the first 3 rows. He said it to the man in seat 2C, who laughed, not because it was funny, exactly, but because laughing was easier than not laughing. A flight attendant named Patricia, who has been working this route for 4 years, heard it. Her face did something briefly, and then returned to neutral, the way faces do in professional settings when something happens that you're not sure whether to address or absorb. She made a decision in that moment. She is still deciding every few minutes whether to revise that decision. And Malik, in seat 3A, looking out at the clouds, Malik heard it too. He hears everything. He has always heard everything. It is one of the things about him that people who don't know him often mistake for vacancy, the stillness, the silence, the looking out of windows. They mistake it for absence, for not paying attention. He is always paying attention. Right now, for instance, he is paying attention to the clouds. He is thinking about how the cloud base altitude correlates with the dew point spread at surface level, and he is estimating, from what he can see, the approximate moisture content of the air mass below the aircraft, and he is comparing this estimate to what the weather briefing he read last night suggested about the Boston approach conditions this afternoon. He is also, simultaneously, tracking the man in row 2. Tracking what he said and when he said it, and the quality of the laugh that followed, and the way the flight attendant's face moved, and the stillness in his mother's shoulders. He has not said anything. He is not going to say anything yet. What he is going to do, what he has already decided to do, with the calm, methodical certainty that characterizes every decision he makes, is wait. Because he knows something that no one else on this aircraft knows. He knows why he is here. He knows what today is. He knows what is waiting at the other end of this flight. And he knows, with the specific, unshakable knowledge of a child who has been underestimated his entire life, that the man in row 2 does not have the faintest idea who he is sitting near. He is about to find out. So is everyone else on Flight 1874. The captain's voice is going to come through the speaker in approximately 41 minutes. And when it does, every person in this cabin, Gregory Holt, the laughing man in 2C, Patricia with her oscillating professional composure, the passengers who heard and said nothing, all of them, is going to understand that the morning they thought they were having is not the morning they were having at all. But we're not there yet. This story has to be understood from the beginning. From the real beginning. Not the beginning of the flight, the beginning of Malik. Subscribe right now and ring that notification bell. This story builds into something extraordinary, and you cannot afford to miss what happens next. Comment below. Have you ever been in a room where someone was being quietly dismissed or mocked, and nobody stepped in? What did that feel like? Tell us. Act 2. Meet Malik, who the quiet boy by the window actually is. To understand Malik, you have to start with quiet. Not the quiet of a child who has nothing to say. Not the quiet of shyness or fear or damage. The quiet of someone who has discovered, early and decisively, that listening is a form of power, that the world gives enormous amounts of information to people who don't interrupt it. That questions answer themselves if you waited. That people revealed themselves, entirely and reliably, if you simply watched them long enough. He was like this from the beginning. Danielle would tell you, if you asked, that Malik came into the world already paying attention. That he had the newborn's necessary squall, and then he was quiet, looking, from the earliest moments, with those dark, serious eyes that took in everything and gave nothing obvious back. That people who held him, as an infant said, he felt like he was reading you. Like he had a question about you, that he was still working out. His full name is Malik Jerome Patterson. His middle name was his grandfather's name. Jerome Patterson was a man who worked for 30 years as an aircraft mechanic for a regional carrier out of Atlanta, a man whose hands knew the internal architecture of engines the way a pianist's hands know keys, by feel, by memory, by the accumulated intelligence of 10,000 hours of work. He never flew as a pilot. He maintained the machines that other men flew. He did this without bitterness and without apology, and he told anyone who asked that the work was meaningful because the work kept people safe, and keeping people safe was the highest form of useful. Jerome Patterson died when Malik was 4 years old. Malik does not remember him clearly. He remembers a smell, engine grease and coffee, and a voice, low and certain, and a large hand covering his small one, and the sense of something solid. That is all. But Danielle has filled in the rest with stories, and the stories have made Jerome Patterson as present in Malik's life as anyone living. More present, sometimes, than people who are physically there. It was through Danielle's stories about Jerome that Malik first understood what an aircraft was. Not as a machine you rode in. As a machine someone built and maintained and made safe. As the product of human intelligence and human hands and human responsibility. As a thing that worked because people understood it and cared for it with precision. He was 5 when this understanding arrived. He asked Danielle that same week to take him to the airport to watch planes. Not to fly. Just to watch. She took him. She had 1 day off every 2 weeks. She was working 2 jobs then, the receptionist position during the day and the inventory shift at the fulfillment center 2 nights a week. And she used one of those days off to take the bus to Hartsfield-Jackson and sit with Malik on a bench near the floor-to-ceiling windows at the international terminal and watch aircraft move. He sat for 4 hours without fidgeting. He asked her questions she couldn't answer. She told him that honestly, I don't know. He seemed to find this satisfactory, to understand that not knowing was the beginning of finding out, not an ending. He started finding out that same week, in the children's section of the Atlanta Public Library, where the librarian, a woman named Mrs. Osei, who became, over the next 6 years, one of the most important people in Malik's life, helped him find the books that were right for his level, and then, as his level accelerated, the books that were right for that level, and then the books beyond that. By age 7, Malik understood how lift works. Not the simplified version, the actual physics. The Bernoulli principle and its complications. The angle of attack and its relationship to lift and drag. He understood it the way you understand something when you've approached it from 5 different directions, and it has made sense from all 5. By age 8, he was reading accident investigation reports from the National Transportation Safety Board. Not because he was morbid. Because the NTSB reports are among the most careful and complete documents in aviation. They spare nothing, they explain everything, they follow the chain of events back to every contributing factor with a rigor that Malik recognized and respected as the highest form of taking something seriously. He read them the way his grandfather's generation read the Bible, as both instruction and devotion. By age 9, he had sketched, from memory, a reasonably accurate diagram of a turbofan engine. His teacher sent it home with a note that said, "I'm not sure what to say about this." His mother framed it. He was, by any measure, extraordinary. But he was also quiet, and he was also black, and he was also being raised by a single mother who worked herself to the edge of what one person can do, and he was also enrolled in a school that did not have the resources to match his level, and he was also living in a world that did not, as a general policy, look at a quiet black boy and see what was there. It saw what it expected to see. He had learned to live inside that gap between what he was and what people assumed he was, with a patience that was not resignation, not defeat. Something closer to strategy. Something that had in it the long view of a person who understands that the proof will come, that the work is the proof, and that no amount of explaining will substitute for the thing itself. Danielle raised him to understand this. She raised him with the specific, hard-won wisdom of a black woman in America who has navigated that gap her entire life, who has walked into rooms and been assessed in the first 3 seconds, and who has responded to that assessment not by being less than she was but by being, with great deliberateness, more. She gave Malik her stillness, her patience, her absolute, bedrock refusal to become smaller under the pressure of other people's limitations. She gave him, in other words, everything she had. And this flight 1874 from Atlanta to Boston, first class, on a clear October morning, is not just a trip. It is not just a flight. It is the destination of 6 years of work, 6 years of library books and NTSB reports and sketched engine diagrams, and a mother who gave her days off to airport benches and her nights to inventory shifts so that she could give her son everything she could not give him from money alone. Something significant is waiting in Boston. The passengers on this flight don't know what it is. Gregory Holt in row 2 does not know. Patricia, the flight attendant, does not know. And Malik is not going to tell them. He is going to sit by the window and look at the clouds and wait for the proof to arrive on its own schedule. Subscribe before the next act. The mockery is about to start, and you need to see exactly how Malik handles it. It's not what you expect. Comment. Was there a person in your life, a parent, grandparent, teacher, who believed in you before you believed in yourself? Tell us about them below. Act 3. Boarding the plane. First class, first looks, and the tension that builds before a word is spoken. The morning had started before sunrise. Danielle had been up since 4:15, moving through the apartment with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has long since made peace with early mornings. She had laid out Malik's clothes the night before, a clean button-down shirt the color of slate, dark slacks, the shoes he'd polished himself because she'd taught him to polish his own shoes the way Jerome had polished his. She had made breakfast. She had double-checked the travel folder, the printout of their boarding passes, Malik's documentation for the event in Boston, her own identification, the hotel confirmation, the schedule for tomorrow. She had sat with her coffee at the kitchen table when the apartment was still dark, and she had done something she did rarely. She had simply sat. Without a task. Without a checklist item. She had sat with her coffee and she had thought about Jerome Patterson, and she had said, quietly, to the kitchen and to the dark, "We made it, Daddy. We're going." She did not know if he could hear her.
She said it anyway.
Malik appeared in the kitchen doorway at 4:40, already dressed, shoes already polished, his backpack on his shoulder. The backpack contained his notebook, 3 aviation reference books, including a dog-eared copy of the FAA Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge that had been checked out of the Atlanta Public Library system so many times that Mrs. Osei had eventually ordered a second copy specifically for him to keep, and a folder of design sketches he'd been working on for the past 2 months. He had also packed, in the front pocket of the backpack, a folded piece of paper that he'd been carrying for 3 weeks. He would not tell his mother what was on it until they landed. This was a decision he'd made and stuck to with the characteristic quiet firmness that characterized all his decisions. He sat across the table from her and ate the eggs she'd made and drank his juice, and they talked about the things they talked about in the morning. Not the big things, not the significant things, but the texture of things. The way the sky looked beginning to lighten outside the window. A fact about cloud formation that Malik had been waiting for the right moment to share. A story Danielle had heard on the radio about a woman who had learned to fly at age 63, which Malik listened to with a focused appreciation of someone filing it under. Evidence for what is possible. The rideshare arrived at 5:20. The driver was a young man who tried to make small talk and then, reading the particular morning atmosphere of the car, let the silence be. Malik watched Atlanta go past the window in the pre-dawn dark, the street lights, the illuminated signs of gas stations, the early traffic on the freeway moving with the purposefulness of people going somewhere that matters. At the airport, everything proceeded with the functional grace that results from thorough preparation. Danielle had checked in online the night before. The TSA line was short at this hour. Malik went through the security process with the practiced efficiency of a child who had studied the procedure in advance, which he had. He had read the TSA guidelines carefully enough to know what would need to come out of the backpack and had organized accordingly. At the gate, they had 45 minutes before boarding. Malik found the largest window facing the tarmac and stood at it and watched the aircraft being prepared. The ground crew, the fuel truck, the baggage being loaded, the pre-flight walk-around being conducted by a pilot in the gray dawn. He watched the pilot move around the plane with a particular quality of attention, checking each point of the exterior with the systematic thoroughness of someone who has performed this walk 1,000 times and has never allowed that familiarity to become complacency. Malik watched the pilot and the pilot's attention, and he learned something from both. Danielle stood beside him for a while and watched him watching. Then she went to find coffee, and he stayed at the window, and when boarding was called, he was there immediately, backpack on, boarding pass ready, the particular composed excitement of a person who has been waiting for something for a long time and is now simply and completely ready for it. They boarded with the first group. Pre-boarding for first class. Malik walked down the jetway without rushing but without slowing either, at the measured pace of someone who wants to be present for each step. He stepped through the aircraft door. He stopped for 2 seconds. He took in a cabin, the layout, the seat configuration, the overhead panel arrangement, the position of the emergency exit indicators, and then he found row 3 and settled into the window seat and placed his backpack carefully in the overhead bin, taking out only the notebook before closing it. He fastened his seatbelt without being reminded. He looked out the window. Other passengers boarded around them. Danielle settled into 3B with her own bag stowed and her phone out. They did not talk much during boarding. They were each, in their separate ways, in the particular internal state of people at the start of something large. Present. Quiet. Ready. The man who sat in 2A, Gregory Holt, with his Navy blazer and his frequent flyer status and his district sales manager's bearing, boarded 6 passengers after them. He found his row. He put his bag in the overhead bin. He sat. And then he looked behind him, in the casual survey that people make of their immediate cabin environment, and his eyes found seat 3A. His survey paused. He looked at Malik. He looked at Danielle. He looked at the seat numbers. Something in his expression moved, a small, involuntary movement of recalibration. He looked away. He said something, very quietly, to the man settling into 2C beside him. The man in 2C glanced back, looked at row 3, looked at Gregory, shrugged. Malik, at the window, was watching the second fuel truck approach the aircraft. He was estimating the fuel load based on the route length and the aircraft type. He was not looking at Gregory Holt, but he had registered in his peripheral processing everything that had just happened in the row ahead. He always registered everything. He said nothing.
The door closed.
The safety demonstration began. Outside, the Atlanta tarmac moved slowly past the window as the aircraft pushed back. The engines rose in pitch. The runway aligned. The throttles advanced. And Flight 1874 lifted into the sky. Subscribe and turn on notifications. In the next act, Gregory Holt begins the mockery, and Malik's response is not what anyone is prepared for. Malik studied the pilot's pre-flight walk-around and learned something from it. Comment: what's the most unexpected place you've ever learned an important lesson? Act 4. The mockery begins. Loud enough to hear, quiet enough to deny, the cruelest register. Gregory Holt began at around the 20-minute mark. He was a man who had cultivated, over decades of professional and social life, an extremely precise calibration for cruelty. Not the blunt, undeniable cruelty that gets people in trouble. Not the kind that leaves a record. The refined kind, the kind delivered at the exact volume and with the exact deniability that allows the person being cruel to later say, with complete technical accuracy, that they never said anything offensive. That it was a joke. That the other person is too sensitive. That they were simply having a private conversation. He turned slightly in his seat and said to the man in 2C, audibly but with the performance of confidentiality, "You notice how quiet it is back there? Quietest first class I've ever been in." It was directed at Malik. It was about Malik's silence. The man in 2C understood this and gave the short, complicit laugh of someone who is not sure they want to be involved, but is not going to object. Patricia was in the galley. She had heard. She began organizing something in the galley that did not need organizing. Malik did not turn from the window. He had identified the cloud formations below as consistent with a warm front advancing from the southwest. He was estimating the ceiling at approximately 8,000 feet, well above the approach minimums for Boston Logan. The flight would be fine. He wrote this in his notebook. Just the numbers. Clean and precise. His mother's hand moved to the armrest between them. Her finger tapped twice, very lightly. Their signal. It meant, "I hear it." It meant, "I am here." It meant everything that needed to be said between them, without words in a room, where words were being monitored. He tapped back once. It meant, "I know." "I'm fine," Gregory continued. He said, still to 2C, still in the register of private conversation that was not private. "You know what I've noticed?" He paused for effect, the way people who enjoy this kind of thing pause for effect. He said, "People who actually travel a lot don't need to look out the window the whole time. They've seen it." He let this sit. He said, "It's the ones who aren't sure they belong up here who do that. They can't believe they made it." The man in 2C said nothing this time. The laughing was becoming harder to sustain. 2 rows back, a woman named Ruth Ellen Briggs heard every word. Ruth Ellen was 67 years old and was flying to Boston to visit her daughter and her 3 grandchildren, and she had the kind of face that had settled, over 6 decades of paying close attention to the world, into an expression of permanent, mild alertness, the face of someone who notices things and files them and waits to understand what they mean before responding. She had noticed Malik when she boarded. She had noticed his backpack, which he had placed in the overhead bin but which had gaped slightly open at the moment he closed it, revealing the spine of the aeronautical handbook. She had noticed the way he fastened his seatbelt without being told. She had noticed, in the 2 exchanges between mother and son since takeoff, the quality of their communication, the tapping fingers, the wordless understanding, and had recognized in it the particular intimacy of 2 people who know each other completely. She had heard Gregory Holt's comments from the beginning. Her expression had not changed, but something behind her eyes had. Patricia came out of the galley with the drink cart. She moved through the first-class cabin with professional efficiency, taking orders, delivering glasses, maintaining the specific warmth that first-class service requires. When she reached row 2, Gregory ordered a bourbon, which Patricia prepared and delivered with a smile that was indistinguishable from her other smiles. Then she moved to row 3. She looked at Danielle.
She looked at Malik.
She looked at the boarding pass Danielle had placed in the seat pocket, and her eyes moved over it briefly before she looked up. The look was a fraction of a second longer than it needed to be. The kind of look that performs a check. That says, "Let me just confirm." Danielle saw the look. She had seen that look before. She had seen it in 100 versions, in 100 contexts, and each time it arrived, no matter how prepared she was, it cost her something small. Something she rebuilt so efficiently that no one ever saw the cost. But she paid it. She said, before Patricia could ask, "Our seats are correct. We're in 3A and 3B. Patricia said, recovering quickly and professionally. "Of course, I'm sorry. Can I get you anything to drink?" Danielle said, "Water, please." She said it evenly. Malik said, without looking away from the window, "Apple juice, please." He said please with the automatic courtesy of a child for whom courtesy was not a performance, but a habit, installed so early it had become structural. Patricia prepared both drinks and moved on. From 2A, Gregory Holt said in his carrying whisper, "Even got the kid talking to the staff like he owns the place." The man in 2C shifted in his seat. He was not laughing anymore. Malik looked at his notebook. He drew, in the margin of the page with the cloud calculations, a careful small sketch of a wing cross-section. He labeled the chord line. He labeled the camber. His handwriting was very precise. "Subscribe before the next act. Malik is about to speak. One sentence. And it's going to land in that cabin like nothing Gregory Holt is prepared for." Gregory used mockery quiet enough to deny, but loud enough to land. Comment. What do you think is the right response when someone uses that kind of disguised cruelty? Act 5. The public humiliation. When quiet cruelty runs out of patience for itself. The flight was 30 minutes in when Gregory Holt stopped being subtle. There is a progression to this kind of behavior. It begins calibrated, contained, deniable. Then it grows, fed by the oxygen of no resistance, by the silence of bystanders, by the professional constraints of crew members, by the target's composure, which men like Gregory consistently misread as weakness rather than what it actually is, which is discipline. The composure of Danielle and the silence of Malik were not invitations. They were not concessions. But Gregory read them as concessions, and concession, to a man like Gregory, is encouragement. He pressed the call button. Patricia came. He said, "I wanted to ask about the seating in this cabin. I've been flying this route for a long time, and this seems like a..." He paused, with the elaborate thoughtfulness of someone constructing a sentence very carefully, an unusual configuration. He gestured, with his bourbon glass, generally toward row 3. Patricia said, "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." He said, "The tickets back there. Are those full-fare first-class tickets? Or is that some kind of upgrade situation? There are programs, aren't there, that allow," he paused again, "that allow certain passengers to access this cabin even if they haven't exactly, paid the rate." The cabin heard this. There was no plausible deniability anymore. He had arranged the sentence carefully, but the meaning sat in it like something left in a room that everyone could smell. What he was saying, with the vocabulary of customer service inquiries and ticketing programs, was, "Are they supposed to be here?" His implication was not about ticket classes. His implication was about people. About which people? Patricia's face performed something difficult. She was a professional and she was also a person, and those two things were, in this moment, in direct conflict with each other. She said, "All passengers in the first-class cabin have valid first-class tickets, sir." Gregory said, Could you just double-check? For me? I'd feel better." The cabin watched. The man in 2C had turned to look at the window with the specific determined absorption of someone who has decided that the window contains something urgently interesting. Ruth Ellen Briggs, in row 5, had put her book fully in her lap and was watching with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who has stopped pretending to look at something else. Patricia turned to row 3. She said, "I'm sorry to bother you. Could I just take a quick look at your boarding passes?" Danielle reached into the seat pocket. She removed both boarding passes, hers and Malik's, and handed them to Patricia with a precision and a steadiness that communicated, to everyone watching, that she had handled versions of this before, and that her steadiness was not agreement. It was not compliance. It was the careful, practice management of something that cost her every time it was required and that she paid anyway because the alternative was worse. Patricia looked at the boarding passes. She said, in a voice that was quieter than her earlier voice, "These are absolutely correct. Full fare first class." "Thank you, Miss Patterson." She handed them back. She looked at Gregory. She said, "Is there anything else I can help you with, sir?" He said, "No, I just wanted to be sure." He said it with a smile. The smile of a man who has won something by making someone else prove themselves. Who has used the machinery of the system, the polite request, the professional obligation to respond, as a weapon, while the weapon itself remained invisible. The boarding passes were correct. He knew they would be correct. Correctness was never the point. Patricia returned to the galley. Her face, once she was past the sight lines of the first 4 rows, did something that the passengers couldn't see. She picked up the interphone. She put it back down. She picked it up again. And Malik, who had watched all of it from 3A, the request, the boarding passes, the smile, turned from the window for the first time since takeoff. He looked at his mother. Danielle was looking at her lap. Her hands were in her lap. They were very still, but the stillness was the effortful kind, not the natural kind, and Malik recognized the difference because he had been reading his mother's stillness his entire life. Her voice, when she spoke to him, quietly, close to his ear, had a quality in it that he had almost never heard before. A wavering at the very edge of it. So small that most people would miss it entirely. Malik heard it. It was the sound of someone who has held everything together for so long and so completely that the holding is beginning, in one very small place, to show a seam. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and put his hand over hers in her lap. His 11-year-old hand, covering hers. She looked at him. Her eyes were level and dry and present. He said, very quietly, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone on this plane. You know that, right?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I know."
He said, "Good."
"Because I do too." He turned back to the window. He picked up his pencil. He continued drawing. Subscribe. Ruth Ellen has been watching from row 5, and she is about to walk to the front of the cabin and ask Malik a question that opens everything up. Malik told his mother, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone on this plane." Comment. Has anyone ever said exactly the right thing to you at exactly the right moment? What were the words? Act 6. Malik speaks, and a nearby passenger notices. The wise words of a quiet boy and the woman who saw what others missed. Ruth Ellen Briggs had made a decision. She made it in the specific way that older people who have been paying attention for a long time make decisions. Not impulsively, not dramatically, but with the settled certainty of someone who has run the calculation and arrived at a clear answer and is no longer interested in delay. She unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood up. She walked forward 2 rows. She stopped beside row 3. She looked at Malik. She said, "Excuse me. I couldn't help noticing. Is that the FAA Aeronautical Handbook in your bag?" The question landed in the cabin's ambient noise with the particular quality of a thing that is unexpected. Gregory Holt in 2A turned slightly. The man in 2C looked over. Malik looked up. He looked at Ruth Ellen with those direct, evaluating eyes. He said, "Yes, ma'am. The 2023 edition." Ruth Ellen said, "I used to fly. Light aircraft, nothing like this. I got my private certificate in 1987 and flew for 12 years before my knees made the pedals a problem." She said it easily, with the unconcerned matter-of-factness of someone sharing a simple fact. She said, "What do you fly?" Malik said, "I don't have my certificate yet. I'm working toward it." She said, "How old are you?" He said, 11. She said, 11. She repeated it not with surprise, but with something more like recognition. Like, "Of course," she said, "and you're reading the handbook on your own time?" He said, "I read it the way other people read other things." He said it simply, without pride, because for him it was simply true. Gregory Holt said from 2A, no longer pretending to be in a private conversation, speaking now at full conversational volume. "That's sweet. Kid's got a hobby." Ruth Ellen did not look at Gregory. She kept her attention on Malik with the specific, deliberate quality of someone who has decided where the conversation is and where it is not. She said, "What's your favorite section?" Malik considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He said, "The weather section." Because weather is the part that most people underestimate. They think about the mechanical systems, the instruments, the procedures. But weather is where the real decisions happen. Weather is where judgment matters most. Ruth Ellen looked at him for a moment. She said, "That is exactly right." She said it the way you say something when a child has told you something true that most adults don't know. With specific, particular respect. The man in 2C had turned to look at the exchange fully now. His expression was doing something different from what it had been doing for the past 30 minutes. Gregory Holt said, "Very impressive. Maybe one day he'll make it to the simulator." Ruth Ellen said, still without looking at him, "He's already passed the simulator."
She said it as a fact.
Not a defense. Not an argument. A fact. She turned back to Malik. She said, "Can I see some of your sketches? If you don't mind." Malik looked at his mother. Danielle gave a small nod. He reached under the seat and took out the folder from his backpack, the folder with the design sketches he'd been working on for 2 months, and he handed it to Ruth Ellen. She opened it. She stood in the aisle, and she looked at the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Her expression moved through several states. Initial assessment, recalibration, something that approached wonder but was too disciplined to become it, settling finally into a kind of quiet gravity. The gravity of someone holding something heavier than they expected. She looked up at Malik. She said, "Did you draw these?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Did anyone help you?" He said, "I used references. But the designs are mine." She said, "These are," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "these are serious work." She handed the folder back. She put her hand briefly on the seat back. She said, "I think you should tell me where you're going." Malik looked at her. He was still. He was evaluating. Then he said, "Boston. There's a competition." And what happened in the cabin when he said those 2 words was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was the slow, irresistible turn of a current, the kind that begins with one sentence and moves outward and reaches people and changes the temperature of a room not all at once but one person at a time until the room is unrecognizable from what it was. Subscribe. In the next act, the full truth about Malik comes out. What he accomplished. Why this flight. What's waiting in Boston. Prepare yourself. Ruth Ellen got up and walked to the front of that cabin because she decided to act. Comment. When was the last time you chose to step into a situation instead of staying silent? Act 7. The hidden truth about Malik. What the boy in the window seat has actually done. The competition is called the National Youth Aerospace Design Challenge. It is run by a consortium of aerospace engineering institutions and funded, in part, by 3 of the largest defense and commercial aviation contractors in the country. It accepts entries from students between the ages of 10 and 18. It receives, in a typical year, just under 4,000 submissions from 42 states. The submissions are evaluated through 3 rounds, a technical review, a design innovation assessment, and a final presentation to a panel of aerospace engineers, active commercial pilots, and representatives from the FAA's Next-Gen Aviation program. In the 12 years the competition has been running, it has never been won by an entrant younger than 14. This year, for the first time, an 11-year-old submitted an entry. The entry was titled, simply, Adaptive Wing Load Distribution in Small Commercial Aircraft Using Passive Structural Response. It was submitted in January. It was accompanied by 11 pages of technical documentation for engineering diagrams and a 3-page methodology section that the first-round evaluator, a structural aeronautics engineer with a master's degree and 12 years of industry experience, later described to her colleague as the most coherent applied reasoning she had read from a student at any level of the competition. The entry made it through round 1, then round 2. Then, in late September, Malik Patterson of Atlanta, Georgia, age 11, was notified that he was one of 5 finalists in the National Youth Aerospace Design Challenge, and that he was required to present his work in person at the competition's final event in Boston on the 12th of October. Today is the 12th of October. Malik did not tell Ruth Ellen all of this. He told her the name of the competition. He told her he was a finalist. He did not tell her the rest because it was not in his nature to enumerate his own credentials, and because the full truth had the particular weight of things that speak for themselves when they arrive. But Ruth Ellen was a woman who had spent 67 years knowing how to ask the right next question. She said, "What is your entry about?" He said, "It's about wings. About how aircraft wings currently handle uneven aerodynamic loads and how a modified structural approach could reduce stress concentrations and extend airframe life in regional commercial aircraft." She said, "And how long have you been working on it?" He said, "The full version, about 2 years. The original idea I had when I was 8. She said, "When you were 8, he said, "I was reading about fatigue cracks in wing spars. There was an accident in 1988, Aloha Airlines Flight 243. An 18-foot section of the upper fuselage tore away at altitude. The NTSB investigation found that the primary factor was metal fatigue from pressurization cycles." He said it the way he said everything, simply, precisely, without performance. He said, "I thought about how the load distribution contributed to the fatigue pattern. I started sketching ideas that night." He was 8 years old when he started sketching ideas that night. Ruth Ellen looked at him for a long moment. The man in 2C had turned fully around. He was no longer pretending to look anywhere else. His face had the expression of a person in the middle of a significant recalibration, the particular, slightly disoriented look of someone whose understanding of a situation has been replaced by something much larger than what he thought he was looking at. Gregory Holt had gone quiet. Not the quiet of reflection. The quiet of someone who has said several things in the past 40 minutes and who is, for the first time, sitting with a gap between what he said and what was actually true. The gap was considerable. The sitting with it was not comfortable. Danielle had said nothing through the entire exchange between Malik and Ruth Ellen. She was watching her son the way she always watched him when he spoke about his work, with the specific, fierce, private pride of a mother who has watched someone become themselves and understands fully what it cost and what it means. Ruth Ellen said, "Does your mother know everything you just told me?" Malik said, "She knows more than I just told you." Ruth Ellen looked at Danielle. Danielle looked back at her. Ruth Ellen said to Danielle, "You raised someone extraordinary." Danielle said, "I gave him everything I could, and then I got out of his way." Ruth Ellen nodded. She understood exactly what that meant. She understood what everything she could meant for a woman in Danielle's position, and she understood what got out of his way meant from a parent who had recognized early that what she had was something that required space, not just support. She said, "I'm going to go back to my seat now." She looked at Malik. She said, "Give them everything you have today. Don't hold anything back." He said, "I never do." She smiled. It was a full, real smile, the kind that doesn't require anything from the recipient. She went back to row 5. Gregory Holt looked at the back of his seat. He did not look at row 3. He had run out of things to say that he was willing to say out loud. Subscribe now. The next act is where the captain finds out who Malik is. And what happens after that changes every person on this flight. Malik started thinking about wing fatigue cracks at age 8. Comment. When did you first discover the thing you were meant to do, or be? How old were you? Act 8. The captain hears and decides. Inside the cockpit, a pause, and then a decision. Patricia had been in the galley since the boarding pass incident. In the professional vocabulary of flight attendants, being in the galley can mean many things. It can mean preparing service. It can mean taking a moment to compose yourself after a difficult passenger interaction. It can mean standing with your hand on the interphone and thinking about whether the thing you are considering doing is the right thing to do, and if so, how to do it correctly. Patricia had been doing the third thing. She had heard Gregory's comments from the beginning. She had made the first decision, not to intervene immediately, to manage it with professional neutrality, and she had been revising that decision with every subsequent exchange. The boarding pass request had been the hardest moment. She had felt, in the act of turning to row 3 and asking Danielle to show her tickets, the specific, uncomfortable feeling of being used as an instrument of someone else's cruelty, of her professionalism being borrowed as a weapon, of her obligation to respond to passenger requests becoming the mechanism by which a family was humiliated. She had been thinking about that feeling for 15 minutes. She had also been listening to the exchange between Malik and Ruth Ellen. She had heard about the competition. She had heard the name of the study, Adaptive Wing Load Distribution. She had heard 8 years old. She picked up the interphone. The flight deck answered on the second tone. First Officer Amara Davis, who was handling radio communications while Captain Louis Trevino managed the flight, said, "Go ahead." Patricia said, "I need to report a passenger conduct situation in first class." She described it accurately and completely. Gregory's comments, the boarding pass request, the escalation, the impact on the family in row 3. She was a good reporter. She had the specificity of someone who has been running a mental record. There was a moment of silence on the flight deck after she finished. Then Captain Trevino's voice came on. He said, "The family in row 3. What's the passenger's name?" Patricia said, "The mother is Danielle Patterson. The boy's name is Malik." There was a pause. Longer than the kind of pause that indicates the captain is noting information. The kind of pause that indicates the captain is recognizing information. Captain Trevino said, "Malik Patterson?" Patricia said, "Yes, sir." Another pause. Captain Louis Trevino had been flying commercial aviation for 23 years. He had, in that time, accumulated the kind of knowledge base that commercial pilots accumulate, broad, deep, and threaded through with the specific interests that different people carry through their careers. Captain Trevino's specific interest, pursued in the hours between flights, was aerospace education. Youth aerospace programs. The pipeline that brought young people, particularly young people from communities that had historically been underrepresented in aviation, into the field. He was on the advisory board of 2 organizations dedicated to this. He read the journals. He followed the competitions. He knew about the National Youth Aerospace Design Challenge. He knew about the 11-year-old finalist from Atlanta. He said, "Patricia, I'm going to make an announcement." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Before I do, is the boy all right? And his mother?" Patricia said, "They're composed. They've been composed the entire time." But she paused, choosing the right word. It cost them something. Captain Trevino said, "Understood." He said, "Give me 5 minutes." He spent those 5 minutes the way good captains spend the moments before they do something that matters, with his hands on the controls, his attention on the flight, his mind running through what he was about to say, and making sure it was accurate and appropriate and worthy of the occasion. Then he straightened in his seat. He picked up the PA handset. He said, "Patricia, we're ready. Subscribe." The captain's voice is about to fill that cabin. Everything that follows is something you need to hear from the beginning. Don't miss a word. Captain Trevino asked, "Is the boy all right?" Before anything else. Comment. What does it say about a person when their first question is about someone else's well-being? Act 9. The unexpected announcement. The captain speaks, and the plane finds out the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. This is your captain, Louis Trevino." The cabin attended. The particular, automatic attention of aircraft passengers receiving a captain's voice. Immediate, complete, the slight straightening of postures, the lowering of phones, the removal of earbuds. He said, "I'm going to take a few minutes of your time this morning to tell you something because I believe it's important. And I believe that when you hear it, you will agree." He paused. The pause itself communicated that what followed was not routine. He said, "We have a passenger aboard this flight today named Malik Patterson. Malik is 11 years old, and he is traveling with his mother from Atlanta to Boston. He is traveling to Boston because tomorrow morning he will be presenting his work at the final round of the National Youth Aerospace Design Challenge, one of the most competitive youth aviation and aerospace competitions in this country." The cabin shifted. The collective, almost audible intake of a group of people receiving information that reorganizes what they thought they knew. Captain Trevino continued, "Malik is one of 5 finalists in this competition. He is the youngest finalist in the 12-year history of the event. His submission concerns adaptive load distribution in commercial aircraft wing structures. In plain language, he designed an approach to making aircraft wings stronger and safer. He has been developing this idea since he was 8 years old. He taught himself from library books, from accident investigation reports, from every resource he could find. He has had no formal aerospace engineering instruction. What he has had is the kind of mind and the kind of commitment that this industry does not see often at any age. Gregory Holt had not moved. He had the specific quality of stillness of a man who cannot move because moving would call attention to what he is sitting with. I also want to tell you something about his mother, Captain Trevino said. Danielle Patterson raised this boy alone. She worked multiple jobs. She made sure he had books when books were what he needed, and time when time was what he needed, and she brought him to this point, to a seat on this aircraft, on his way to a national final, because of what she gave him and what she chose not to take from him. The cabin was very quiet, not the formal, managed quiet of professional settings. The quiet that falls when something true has been said in a room and the truth has a weight that holds the air. Captain Trevino said, "I am telling you this for one reason. Not because Malik or his mother asked me to. Not because I was required to. But because it came to my attention this morning that this young man and his mother were treated, on this flight, in a way that was not consistent with who they are or what they deserve. And I want every person on this aircraft to know, with complete clarity, who is sitting in row 3. He paused again. He said, "Malik, if you can hear me, we are honored to have you on this flight. I speak on behalf of this entire crew when I say that we see you. We have always seen you. And we look forward to hearing about what you accomplish in Boston." The intercom clicked off. For 4 seconds, the cabin held the silence. Then it broke. Not in the uniform, managed way that applause sometimes breaks in contained spaces. It broke the way something breaks when it has been building pressure, uneven at first, then gathering, then filling the cabin from the back rows to the front with the specific sound of people clapping because they have been moved and they have no other available language for being moved. Malik looked out the window. His face was very still. His eyes were tracking something in the distance, the horizon, the edge of the cloud mass, the thin line where the blue of the upper atmosphere met the white of the cloud layer. Below. He was looking at it the way he looked at everything, with complete, patient, directional attention. But his jaw was working slightly. The way jaws work when a person is holding something that is large and does not quite fit inside the ordinary dimensions of a face. He did not cry. He was Malik Patterson, and he had been practicing this kind of stillness his entire life, and he would not cry in row 3 of first class on flight 1874. But something moved through him, visible if you were watching closely, visible as the slight, involuntary tightening and releasing of his hands in his lap, visible as the single, slow blink. Danielle was watching. She had been watching him from the moment the announcement began. Her hand found his again in his lap. This time the squeeze was different from all the previous squeezes. This time it said something that they had never quite had words for, something about what it took to get here, and about arriving anyway, and about Jerome Patterson, who polished his hands on engine grease for 30 years, and whose name his grandson carried, and whose belief his daughter had carried since the kitchen was dark at 4:15 in the morning. Malik squeezed back. Then he turned from the window. For the first time on the flight, he turned fully toward the cabin. He looked at the faces looking at him, and he smiled. Subscribe and share this right now. The next act is justice, redemption, and the cockpit door opening for Malik. This is the moment the story earns. The captain said, "We have always seen you." Comment: what would those words mean to you if you had been sitting in row 3 all morning? Act 10, justice, redemption, and the cockpit. The ending that the whole flight was building toward. Gregory Holt did not turn around. He sat facing forward in seat 2A while the applause moved through the cabin around him, and he was very still, and his stillness had a different quality now from any of his previous stills. Earlier his stillness had been the stillness of composure, the poise of a man who is accustomed to the room arranging itself around him. This stillness was something else. This was the stillness of a person who has been comprehensively wrong, and who is, for the first time in a long time, fully aware of it. Not wrong in the way that people are wrong when they have made an error of information. Wrong in the way that people are wrong when they have made an error of character. When they have looked at a person and seen a category instead of a human being. When they have treated someone's composure as evidence of guilt rather than of discipline. When they have used the size of their voice to compensate for the smallness of their perception. He did not look at row 3. He looked at the headrest in front of him, and he held the enormity of what he had said and done in the past hour, and it was considerable, and the holding of it was not comfortable, and it should not have been comfortable. The man in 2C caught Gregory's eye. He looked away quickly. He had laughed. He had not been the one making the comments, but he had laughed, and he had been silent when silence meant complicity, and he was sitting with his portion of that now. Patricia came out of the galley. She walked to row 3. She crouched in the aisle so that her face was level with Malik's. She said, "I owe you an apology. When I came to check your boarding passes, I knew they were correct. I should have said so from the start instead of asking at all."
I'm sorry.
She said it directly. Not with the professional formula of a customer service script. She said it the way one person apologizes to another person when they have done something wrong and they know it, and they are willing to say so out loud. Malik looked at her. He said, "Thank you for calling the captain." She said it was the right thing to do. "I should have done it sooner." She stood up. She looked at Danielle. She said, "Is there anything I can get you?" "Anything at all." Danielle said, "We're fine." She said it without edge, without residue. She had the capacity for this, for receiving a genuine apology and letting it be what it was, without making the person who gave it feel the full weight of what made the apology necessary. She had this capacity because she had been practicing it her entire life, which was its own complicated thing, its own particular demand on a person's reserves. But she had it and she used it, and it was grace. Ruth Ellen Briggs, in row 5, was not applauding. She had been applauding but had stopped because she was too busy looking at Malik with the expression of a woman who has just had something confirmed that she suspected from the beginning. The expression of a person whose read of a room turned out to be correct in the best possible direction. She caught his eye across the 2 intervening rows. She gave him a nod. Just one nod. The kind of nod that carries everything it needs to carry. He nodded back. The passengers around them, the ones who had heard and been silent, the ones who had witnessed the boarding pass incident and held their discomfort privately, the ones who had been running their own internal accountings for the past several minutes, went about the work of being changed by something. The small, quiet work of a room that has received a truth it had been missing and is now reorganizing around it. Passengers in the rows behind first class, who had heard the announcement and understood its context even without having witnessed the morning's events directly, leaned to speak to their seatmates. Some of them looked forward, toward the first-class curtain, with expressions that were trying to find the right form. And then the cockpit door opened. Captain Louis Trevino stepped into the first-class cabin. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with the kind of face that has been resolved, that has made its peace with most of the things that faces spend their younger years negotiating. He looked at row 3.
He looked at Malik.
He said, "I wanted to introduce myself." Malik looked up at him. Captain Trevino said, "I've been following the design challenge for several years. I know your entry. I read it when the semi-finalist list was announced." He said it matter-of-factly, the way pilots say things, without excess, precisely. He said, "Your analysis of the spar fatigue distribution is genuinely original. I said that to my first officer this morning on pre-flight, before we boarded. I said, 'We've got one of the finalists on this flight.'" Malik was very still. He said, "You knew?" Captain Trevino said, "The manifest. I check it." He said, "I look for names I recognize." "Your name I recognized." "A beat." Malik said, "I had a question about the fatigue model. In the 3rd section. I wasn't sure if the stress concentration factor I used for the modified spar geometry was conservative enough." Captain Trevino looked at him. Something in his face shifted, a very small shift, the kind that happens when a person meets a level of seriousness that is not what they expected and that recalibrates them. He said, "Let me see the sketch." Malik took the folder from the seat back. He opened it to the 3rd section diagram. He handed it up. The captain held it. He looked at it for 20 seconds, a full 20 seconds, in the middle of the first-class aisle, with the plane at cruise and the passengers watching and Gregory Holt sitting with everything he deserved to be sitting with in seat 2A. He said, "Your factor is conservative enough. In fact, it's conservative enough that you have room to revise the geometry slightly more aggressively and still stay within safe margins. That might actually strengthen your design argument at the panel." Malik took the folder back. He looked at the sketch. He picked up his pencil. He made a notation in the margin, clean, precise, 3 characters and a number. He looked up. He said, "Thank you, Captain." Captain Trevino said, "The honor is mine." He looked at Danielle. He said, "Your son is going to change things." I don't say that lightly. Danielle looked at her son. She looked at this person she had fed before sunrise and driven to airports and bought library books for and squeezed hands with in the dark and carried, in every sense of the word, to this aircraft, to this row, to this morning. She said, "I know." Captain Trevino said, "When we land, I'd like to invite Malik to visit the cockpit. If you're agreeable." She said, "He would love that." Captain Trevino nodded. He turned and walked back toward the cockpit door. He stopped once, turned slightly. He said, to the general cabin, "Thank you all for your patience this morning." The cabin applauded again. Properly this time, not the release of something that had been building, but a response. A reciprocal act. A cabin returning something to a captain who had given them something. Captain Trevino closed the cockpit door. Gregory Holt sat very still in seat 2A. In row 3, Malik opened his notebook to a fresh page. He wrote, in the clean, precise handwriting his mother had sat beside him and practiced with him 100 times at the kitchen table after dinner, stress concentration factor, revised. Below it, a number. Below the number, a small arrow and a new sketch. Quick, confident, the first draft of a revision that would strengthen an argument that was already extraordinary. He drew the wing. Outside the window, 37,000 feet below, the earth moved. The particular American earth of October, the early color in the trees, the silver threads of rivers, the geometry of cities. The country, moving past him, going about its enormous and ordinary life. Malik looked at it briefly. Then he looked back at the page. He had work to do. The plane landed at Boston Logan at 11:47 in the morning. The passengers deplaned in the ordinary, efficient way of passengers after a successful flight. They gathered their bags and filed toward the door and exchanged the brief, nodding farewells of strangers who have shared a tube of pressurized air for 2.5 hours and who are now returning to their separate lives. Several of them, the man in 2C, the couple in 4A and 4B, the woman from 6C who had been in the back when the announcement was made and who had pieced together the morning from the fragments reaching her, stopped as they passed row 3.
Some said something.
Some just nodded, the full, deliberate nod that means I was here, and I saw it. And I want you to know I saw it. Gregory Holt passed row 3, without stopping. He did not look at Malik or Danielle as he passed. He walked with his briefcase and his navy blazer, and the specific carrying posture of a man who is transporting something heavy in a place that doesn't show.
He should have said something.
He knew it and did not do it, and the not doing of it would cost him something, in the way that the things we should do and don't do always cost us something. It costs us in the quiet of 3 in the morning, in the involuntary replay of a specific 23 seconds on a plane over the eastern seaboard on a clear October morning, in the slow, grinding accounting that conscience keeps, whether or not we intend to let it. He walked past. He stepped into the jetway. He went back to his life. And Malik walked forward to the cockpit. The last passengers had deplaned. The gate was quiet, the clean, particular quiet of an aircraft after all the people have gone, before the cleaners come. Patricia held the curtain. First Officer Amara Davis opened the cockpit door from inside and looked out and smiled at Malik in the direct, respectful way that professionals smile at other professionals they are glad to meet. Captain Trevino was in the left seat. He turned when Malik entered. He said, "Welcome to the flight deck." Malik stepped in. He stood in the doorway for the length of a breath, taking in the instruments, the displays, the view through the windscreen of the Boston tarmac and the sky above it, and his face was the face of someone standing in a place they've been going their whole life. He said, "I've studied these instruments from photographs. But the photographs don't get the scale right." Captain Trevino said, "They never do." He asked if Malik wanted to sit in the right seat. Malik looked at his mother, who was standing in the doorway behind him. She nodded. He sat. He sat in the first officer's seat of a commercial aircraft, and he put his hands on his knees, and he looked through the windscreen at the Boston sky, and whatever was on his face in that moment was not for the camera, and not for the cabin, and not for the account of any stranger who might later tell the story. It was his. Private. Real. He had been going to this seat his entire life. He was 11 years old. He was here. There is a thing that happens when you dismiss someone. When you look at a quiet child by an airplane window and decide, in the 3 seconds you spend looking, that you know what you are seeing. When you arrange your behavior around that decision and spend an entire flight acting on it, confident in the decision, reinforced by the absence of visible protest. When the world confirms, again and again, your right to decide who belongs where and what the silence of the quiet ones means. There is a thing that happens to you when the truth arrives. It is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be comfortable. The discomfort is the cost of the error, and the error was not of information but of character, and errors of character carry a different kind of debt than errors of fact. They are owed not to a record but to a person, to a specific, irreducible, extraordinary person who is sitting in seat 3A the entire time, drawing wing cross-sections in the margin of a notebook, carrying an idea about aircraft fatigue that he had been developing since he was 8 years old. They are owed to his mother, who worked 2 jobs and used her days off to take the bus to the airport, and who sat in first class that morning with her hands still in her lap, and who paid the cost of other people's limitations without complaint and without surrender. They are owed to Jerome Patterson, who kept engines safe for 30 years and who left behind a name and a smell of engine grease and coffee, and a grandson who would one day stand in a cockpit and look through the windscreen at the sky and know, with the certainty of someone who has been traveling toward a place their whole life, that they had arrived. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The ones who look out windows and say nothing. The ones who absorb what cannot be fully absorbed and continue anyway. The ones whose silence is not vacancy but strategy, the long, patient, absolutely certain strategy of a person who knows that the proof is coming and has decided to let it speak for itself. The proof always speaks for itself. It spoke that morning, at 37,000 feet, over the eastern seaboard of the United States, on Flight 1874 from Atlanta to Boston. In Seat 3A, by the window, drawing wings. And, if Malik's story moved you, if it made you feel something that you want to keep, please subscribe, hit like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. New stories like this every single week, because stories like this one deserve to be told. Final question. What do you want to say to Malik Patterson? What do you want to say to Danielle? Leave your message in the comments below. Every single one gets read. This community sees you, the way the captains saw Malik.